In this video, I'm going to make up the 1958 boat neck blouse that we previously cut out of my large-scale puffball factory fabric. If you need a reminder, this is the blouse right here that we are going to make up, and I have cut this out in a large-scale print earlier, and so I'm going to make up the blouse. I've gone through the instructions for the blouse and I've made a couple of decisions based on the instructions. The instructions call for the neckline and the armholes to be finished with bias binding, and I have cut 1.5 inch bias binding out. I do think that I should use the bias binding on the neckline because I don't want a heavy finish on the neckline. I want it to be able to drape. So I'm going to use the bias binding on the neckline, but I would rather use a facing for the armholes. So I have cut an armhole facing for the front and back, and I'm going to use facing on the armholes. I'm also pretty sure that I would like to add a zipper to this blouse, a side zipper. I've got an invisible zipper, which I'm going to install on the left side, starting at the bottom and going up, and hopefully that will make this easier to get into. I don't know if I'm going to want to put darts in it right now, but we'll see as we go along. So let's get started. This is actually a very easy blouse to make up, and we'll go through it step by step. The first thing that we're going to do is to sew the shoulder seams. I'm going to start by pinning the shoulder seams together. And then stitching them. We are going to use a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and once I have finished stitching them, I'm going to press the seams open. I've finished my seams and have, in my case, I serged the edges and I've pressed both of the shoulder seams open. The next thing we're going to do is to bind the neckline. So I'm going to turn it over, and I've got my bias strips cut out. One of the things that it's important to do in order to keep the crispness of the boat neck is to do each piece separately. So don't wrap the bias around the neckline. Do two separate pieces that end at the corners here. So I'm going to leave plenty of space, and I'm going to pin on both sides of my bias binding along the neckline. And when we're done, we'll have two pieces that we will sew on separately. So I'll show you once I finished one, and then we'll look at sewing the other one on so that they are crisp and meet at the shoulders, and we don't have any rounded corners at the shoulder. You're going to have a nice crisp boat neck. So get those pinned, and then we'll sew them up and take a look. Now that we've got the first side of our binding sewn on to one side of the neckline, we're going to tackle the second side. I'm going to start here at the corner, and I'm going to fold this first piece of facing back along the shoulder seam, and then I can place my second piece over it and start pinning it in place. And I'll show you once I'm finished with this what I did to make sure that I stopped my stitching at the right place here on the facing, because you do want it to match exactly. So I'm going to mark that with a pin so that I know where to stop sewing so that I'll get a really sharp corner right there. So once I have pinned this along the neckline, I'm going to go back to my corner here, and I have folded this back right here along the shoulder seam, and I'm going to lay this over, and then I'm going to place a pin right, and I should be able to, right at the shoulder seam, following that seam line. I'm going to turn it around and check. I need to come down just a tad. I want it to be right where the stitching stops. So that is going to be about here. I'm going to put my pin in right across so I see where it is, and then I'm going to mark it right along that seam line so that my pin is following the shoulder seam exactly, and I know that I should stop right here or start right here when I stitch along on this side. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to fold this back, and I'm going to mark right where my previous seam ends so that I'm going to know that that's how far I need to stitch. Okay, the second side is done, and I've got both pieces of bias put on, and I kind of pushed this up over the shoulder seam, and I'm going to just trim it off. So when I complete the bias tape, I will be able to fold these corners in, and I'm going to slip stitch them in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim my seam allowance down. I'm going to fold up this seam allowance and then bring it over to the inside and slip stitch in place to make my finishing. So that is the finishing for the neck. I've finished the neckline and given it a good pressing, and you can see how the corners are nice and sharp on both sides because I did it separately. And if we look at the inside, we've got a nice little bias finish around the edge. I think it looks nice, and so the next step is going to be working on the armholes. Now that we've finished the neck, we want to work on the sleeve facing. So I'm going to take a front and a back of the sleeve facing and join them at the shoulder seam. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to press the seam open and then finish the long outside edge of my sleeve facing. I'm not doing the underyarn seam yet because we're going to do that after we put the zipper in. I'm just going to do the shoulder seam and then finish the long edge of the sleeve facing. I finished sewing my armhole facings together, pressed the seam open, and I finished the long edge outside. So the next step is to attach the facings to the armhole. So I've got my top all finished here. I'm going to go to the armhole. I'm going to just check. This is the front and this is the front. So I'm going to match my shoulder seams and pin them in place. And then I'm going to pin my facing in place and stitch it. And once we're done with that, we'll come back and trim the seams, and then we'll understitch, which is very important. So let's get this sewn up right now. Once we've finished sewing our facing to our armhole. Then we want to trim the seam relatively close to the stitching so that we can understitch. So you want to start around here and trim the seam so that it's about 1/8 of an inch. So it's like this. You're doing a really close trim to this seam so that you're getting rid of all this bulk that you've got around the armhole. And then once we have finished our trim, what we're going to do is understitch this armhole all the way around and then press it, and that is really going to keep the facing from rolling forward and give you a nice clean finish. Okay, so we've got this trimmed, and then we're going to go and understitch it. When you understitch, what you're doing is you're stitching this seam allowance to the facing. You pull both sides very taut and you stitch right along the facing. Stitch the seam allowance to the facing. This means that you don't need to clip your seam because the seam allowance is so small. Once you do a really small seam allowance and understitch it, you'll get a smooth curve without clipping. Now I have understitched my seam. You can see it's all stitched in place here. And if we look on the right side, you can see that the seam is stitched down and it kind of just automatically wants to roll back in place. So you don't even have to do much. It makes the seam want to roll in like this. And it's a really nice roll. And it's an easy way to get a smooth seam where the facing doesn't come out and you don't have to clip, and you get that little uneven edge sometimes when you're clipping around an armhole. So see how nice that is? So now we're going to press it, and once we've pressed it, what we'll do is we'll just go and tack the seam allowance in place right at that shoulder seam. And then we're going to start on the side seams. Now that we've got the neckline and the armholes done, it's time to start on the side seams. I almost always do my neck and my armholes, especially if it's sleeveless, before doing my side seams, even if the pattern tells you to do your side seams first. And the main reason for that is it's much easier to work on a neck if you don't have those side seams sewn up. You have a flat surface and it's easier to sew. And the same thing if you have a sleeveless garment, putting in a sleeve facing is much easier if you don't have your side seams sewn. So that is why I will always do the neck first on most of the garments I make. Another reason that I think is very important for vintage garments is these garments are often drafted for specific vintage undergarments, and you may or may not want to wear them under your finished garment. And that's going to affect how it fits. And most often what it's going to affect is the bust point. And so it's a good idea to be able to adjust your bust point before you sew it up. If that's the first thing you did, which is what many patterns call for, now you have to rip it out and re-sew it if it's not right. But I don't have my side seams sewn and I don't have my bust darts sewn. So I can test it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my fabric inside out, and I'm going to locate my bust dart, and I'm going to pin it in place. Just pin it closed, just like this. I've already done most of it, but here in this case, I've pinned my dart closed so that I am simulating my dart. And this way, it's pretty easy. I can just put the blouse over my head and adjust it and see where my bust point falls. In my case, I'm very happy with where it is. I had actually already dropped this because remember in the video where I cut it out, I mentioned that I wanted to add some length to my armhole and hopefully at the same time drop my bust point. So, and you can see I needed that length in the armhole. That armhole is probably hitting just about where I like it, and my bust dart is right in the right place. But if I had sewn up the bust dart before and I hadn't made this adjustment, it would be in the wrong place and I'd have to rip it out and re-sew. So this is a nice way to just do a quick test and make sure that it's in the right place. Well, now that mine is in the right place, I'm going to sew it up and press it out. Now I have sewn my darts and pressed them, and I've also finished my side seams. And now it's time to sew them up. The right side seam is pretty simple, and we're going to just pin it together, match your underarm seams right at your facing to make sure that it's even, and then you can just pin in place, and we're going to just stitch this up with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Now the left seam is going to be a little different. I would like to add a zipper in this. I think that I may end up putting some darts in this top, and I just think it's easier to put on with a zipper. So the right seam, it's just pinned in place, and I will stitch it up and press it open. Now on the left side, let's bring this over. We're going to mark 2 places. At the top, we're going to mark 1 inch below the armhole. So we can just measure that off and make a mark. And then we're also going to mark 2 inches from the hem. So I want to mark those 2 places, and then I'm going to turn around and mark it on the back just to make sure that I am even all around. So there's my 1 inch, and there is my 2 inch. So I'm going to start off by taking my top and matching my underarm seams, put those in place. Oops. Yeah. And then I'm going to sew down to this 1 inch mark. I'm going to sew through the facings, so I'll pin those, and I'm going to sew from the facing to the mark here. I'm just going to sew a 5/8 seam, and then I'm going to press that open. And then we'll come back, and I'm going to install an invisible zipper in this seam. My zipper is a little long, so I'm going to cut it back. But I'm going to install an invisible zipper right here. So let's get the seam sewed up, and then we'll come back and look at the zipper. I finished sewing up my seams, and here's my right seam. I've pressed it open, and I've folded down and pressed the sleeve facing in place as well. And then I will tack this in place right here. So the right side is done. Now on the left side, I have sewn the seam up to my 1 inch mark here. And then I've pressed this down, and I will also tack this down when I'm done with the zipper. And so I'm going to use an invisible zipper. I have adjusted the size of the zipper so that it will end up here at that 1-inch mark, and that the zipper is down at my 2-inch mark. So I'm going to use an invisible zipper foot and sew this zipper in place on my blouse. And so I've got it the 2 inches here because I've got a 1-inch seam allowance, and I want the seam allowance and then the zipper and the zipper pull will be hidden in that area of the seam allowance and not hang down below the hem. That's why I'm stopping the actual zipper at this 2-inch mark. So I'm going to go install my zipper and we'll see how it looks. Okay, I've finished the right seam. I have put in an invisible zipper that goes like this, that will make the blouse a little easier to get into. This is not part of the original pattern. The vintage pattern does say that you will slip it on over your head. I decided I would prefer to have a zipper, so I have installed a zipper here. I think it looks really nice. I usually like to use invisible zippers if I put them in a blouse because you really can't tell that they're there, and it just makes it a lot easier. If we turn it to the inside, you can see here the zipper has been installed. I've stopped with enough room for my hem, which we'll do next. I have tacked down my facing. I've put it over my zipper so that that's also securing the zipper in place. And then on the other side, I've also tacked down my facing so that it's held in place, so that the armhole facing is nice and firm and won't roll out. So the next thing we're going to do is the hem. It's a 1-inch hem. I'm going to finish the edge, and I am going to do just a straight stitch machine hem on this blouse because I think that will look good. So I'm going to take a few minutes, do the hem, and then we're going to try it on and see how everything looks. There we go. I finished the hem. It's just a machine hem, and I've made sure that I turned in the hem edges right at the edge of the zipper, and then I slip stitched those edges so that when I close it, I've got a nice finish here at the edge. So I think that it works really nice. And now let's try it on, see how it fits, and hopefully be wearing it a lot. Well, the blouse is done, and I think it came out really nicely. If you watched the video that I did on laying out the fabric, you'll notice that I have got the figure right over here, this little starburst in the center. I've got a little bit of the window on the shoulder, but not very much. I've got my seam matching with the little puffballs on the side, and I've got my exit sign in the back where I wanted it. So the placement turned out the way I'd like. The next thing we want to do is just try it on and see how it fits and see if there's any other adjustments we would like to make before it's finished. So I'm going to step out and try this on and see how it looks. And here we have it, the 1958 boat neck blouse. I like the boat neck. I like the way it fits. I like the length. It seems to sit really nicely on my hips. I feel it's a little boxy for the way that I like to wear my tops. I could wear a belt, but I don't think it's going to hit in a good place on me. So I'm going to look at maybe putting a few darts in this top and see how that looks. Okay, so I've added some fisheye darts in the front and the back. They're a 1/2 inch each, so I actually took 2 inches out of the waist here, and I do think that it makes a difference. I like it with the darts. The pattern is not originally made to have darts shaping. It's supposed to be a much more boxier top, but my personal preference is to have this little bit more shaping. And the fact that I added a zipper makes that possible. I do really like that the darts really don't take away from the pattern at all. So I think it's very successful. I'll be posting some pictures of the finished garment online, but thank you for watching this video, and hopefully once I issue the pattern, you'll get a chance to make this blouse up, and hopefully you'll be able to use a large scale print as well. I think it gives a modern look to a vintage pattern. So we've made up this vintage pattern in this print, and I think it turns out great. Thank you for watching, and make sure to subscribe to see more videos.